What is up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, just welcome. My name is Gemma Jade, but today we are going to be discussing tulpas. The tulpa phenomenon, if that's what you want to call it, was originally brought forth through the ancient teachings of Buddhism. Tulpa translates roughly in English as the word manifestation, and honestly, that's the perfect alternate word for exactly what it is. Most of us have some clue or idea what a tulpa is, and I would say that basically when the human mind effectively brings some thought, idea, or form into the real world, into real life, that's what it is. They don't only come from the human imagination though, they can also be brought out from our dreams and even our nightmares. The fact of the matter is, to one degree or another, every single person on this planet has the ability, mostly, to bring forth certain entities and other things that otherwise wouldn't have ever existed. For example, the first thing I think about when I think of the word tulpa is the Slender Man. Many people believe that most cryptids, such as the Dogman, Bigfoot, and even the Mothman, are all tulpas too. So many times. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that most of the time, the entity or being created runs rampant and wild and turns on you, the person who created it in the first place. Tulpas aren't something where we bring them into existence and have dominion over them. That's more of a darker type of witchcraft. What happens is we give them life and off they go. And more often than not, they simply run around and run wild and do whatever the heck they want. The phenomenon can very quickly and easily get away from us. It's more than just a troublesome issue too, and very quickly it all gets out of the control of the creator. More often than not too, the person who creates the tulpa doesn't do it on purpose, and in fact, most of them are created by accident, completely accidentally. They are far more than troublesome, and most of them, and I don't know why this is, are manipulative and very lower vibrational. This isn't to say that all thought forms come to life are negative or bad, but I will say that more often than not, and I'm sorry to keep using that term, that's the way they turn out one way or another and to one degree or another. Take a child that has an imaginary friend. Some children aren't seeing spirits of the deceased or other entities that already exist in the ether or wherever else, but in fact have created their own. Now, while these imaginary playmates might serve the child well as a beloved friend while they're still young, what happens when the child grows and there isn't another one at its disposal to go to? It gets angry, and like the child, it acts out. This is the best example I can give you of how even good and positive tulpas end up being negative and oftentimes disastrous. They become manipulative, deceptive, and downright evil. It's like they want to make sure they're able to keep the form that they've finally been given. I'm trying to keep this very simple and water it down a bit, so bear with me. I dare say, be careful what you wish for, guys, especially if you're already someone predisposed to being able to do things like this. Most of us here on this channel, or at the very least my Wednesday and Thursday night gemstones, are more predisposed to this type of thing. That's you. There was a woman who went by the name Dion Fortune, real name Violet Firth. She was a mystic and occultist, as well as being an author of several different, fairly interesting books, and many of them were critically acclaimed, which was almost unheard of for those types of books at the time, back in her day. She was actually someone who would purposefully create tulpas and then unleash them on her enemies and people who she thought deserved it. Trust me when I tell you, as someone who has tried this, it's the absolute worst thing you could do, not only to the other person, but to yourself as well. Because regardless of where it goes or how long it's been since you've seen it or known what it was up to, you are and forever will be responsible for it, at least in the eyes of the universe and in terms of universal law. Anyways, Dion Fortune said, quote, "I myself once had an exceedingly nasty experience in which I formulated a werewolf accidentally. Unpleasant as the incident was, I think it may be just as well to give it publicity, for it shows what may happen when an insufficiently disciplined and purified nature is handling occult forces. I have received serious injury from someone who, at considerable cost to myself, I had disinterestedly helped, and I was sorely tempted to retaliate. Lying on my bed resting one afternoon, I was brooding over my resentment, and while so brooding, drifted towards the borders of sleep. There came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraints and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf of horror of the north. Immediately, I felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. It was well materialized ectoplasmic form. It was gray and colorless, and it also had weight. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as it lay beside me on the bed as a large dog might. I knew nothing about the art of making elementals at that time, but had accidentally stumbled upon the right method. The brooding, highly charged with emotion, the invocation of the appropriate natural force, and the condition between sleeping and waking in which the etheric double readily extrudes, end quote. Interesting how she referred to her thought form as an elemental, but now that I think about it, as I sat writing the script and I was kind of rehashing that word, elemental, tulpa, elemental thought form, that's exactly what they are, and actually the perfect way to mention and or refer to one. This isn't the only way to make one, but it does sound about right. Let's move on to the aforementioned Slender Man and talk about why I'm fairly sure that he is a thought form tulpa as well. I know it's going to be weird to some of you all who are familiar with not only Slender Man himself, but now also with elementals, but hear me out. Nick Redfern, one of my most favoritist people and authors in the world, despite my not knowing him personally, yet, of course, wrote in his book, The Slender Man Mysteries, an Internet Urban Legend Comes to Life, quote, on an episode of the hugely popular paranormally themed talk show Coast to Coast AM, the host, George Norrie, took a number of calls from people who claimed to have personally encountered the Slender Man. They all described the Slender Man as looking like Eric Knudson's monster. In some cases, the witnesses claimed the Slender Man invaded their dreams. Others said they saw the Slender Man out in the real world. It was the Coast to Coast AM show that really demonstrated what was going on was the beginning of a radical and sinister shift in the Slender Man phenomenon. What was first fiction was now rapidly becoming something else entirely. Some might suggest that the people who phoned in to Coast AM were hoaxers. Okay, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. But in certain terms, it doesn't really matter. If enough of the Coast to Coast AM audience believed what they were hearing, then that collective and combined belief would have gone a significant way towards ensuring that the tulpa version of the Slender Man would soon be up and running. And guess what? He was, end quote. Guys, that's exactly my point right there, what he just said. If the person hearing it and believes it, and if enough people all believe it at once, regardless of proximity to each other and whether or not they know each other, then it can collectively be created. Nick Redfern also has some pretty interesting theories regarding the possibility that the Men in Black are tulpas as well. I don't know where I stand with that one, guys, if I'm really being honest, because there are so many other things that make so much more sense when it comes to the MIB than tulpas, but I think it's worth seeing what he said and hearing him out. After all, none of us actually know what they actually are, and so gathering all of the information together is the best way to make the most informed decision. After all, knowledge really is power. As hokey and cheesy and as cliche as that may sound to you, it's simply a matter of fact. So Nick Redfern said of the MIB being possible thought forms, quote, the kindling of virtual state tulpoidal forms in the zeroth bioframe of physical reality, materialization, can result in the materialization of living, breathing, functioning forms. There is essentially no limit on the format that may be obtained. Sasquatch, Nessie, fairies, demons, angels, Mothman, skunkmen, Yeti, kangaroos, etc. are just a small sampling, end quote. On this same matter of tulpas, the MIB are addressed in this fashion. Quote, the Men in Black syndrome is based on our own unconscious tuning. Since each of us has some unpleasantness in the unconscious, sometimes the tuned in Men in Black can be very nasty indeed, end quote. This one is a little far out there, even for me. I know fairies to be elementals, but then again, we just discussed that, and I'm on board with tulpas being the bulk of the entities that we know as the elemental. Also, who can really say for sure whether or not the so-called cryptids we have all come to know, love, and loathe so much aren't tulpas that were created hundreds of years or possibly millennia ago? I know I can't say any of that for sure, and I think it would be a bold statement indeed if anyone were to say anything different. As for me though, I feel like a lot of these entities are separate things, and while that's definitely the case for each individual tulpa, I just don't get the right sort of feeling when it comes to the MIB being tulpas. So basically, it just doesn't ring true to me, so to speak. Also, when it comes to things like fairies, angels, and demons, because of my abilities, I know better than to believe they are simply sprung forth from someone's mind millennia ago or at the dawn of creation. But I will say that I still think it's worth discussing because of how obscure it all is. It's so unknown. It's just too unknown to be able to say anything definitively or to cast anything aside altogether. So there was a woman who I came across in my research for this video who I would be totally remiss in not mentioning here. Her name was Alexandra David Neal, and she lived to be 101 years old. She lived a very active and rich life right up until the day she took her final breath. She was a Buddhist and loved Tibet and the people there very dearly. She was not only interested in Buddhism, but she was also a self-proclaimed anarchist, which makes me absolutely love her so much more. What a beautiful and fantastic juxtaposition. She wrote a book in 1929 called Magic and Mystery of Tibet, and I never read it, but Nick Redfern described it as, quote, a fine and entertaining tale of road trip proportions and with a large dose of the supernatural thrown in, end quote. I bring all this up because she says that while she was in Tibet on one of her many visits there, she learned about and became kind of enchanted by the idea of the tulpa. She would soon become disenchanted though, and very quickly, once she went out of her way to create one of her own. She primed it in her mind, activated it with her thoughts, and called it forth. Whether with words or thoughts doesn't matter. She had created one of her very own tulpas. Here's the deal. The tulpa themselves want to make sure that they stay alive, right? I mean, wouldn't you want to make sure you stayed alive? I mean, wherever they come from, they don't want to go back once they are living, breathing entities operating in our three-dimensional reality. This is the problem Miss Fortune faced once she had the entity created, fully formed and ready to go. In order to help her readers better understand the dangers of creating such a thing, she wrote about it in her book. She said, quote, once the tulpa is endowed with enough vitality to be capable of playing the part of a real being, it tends to free itself from its maker's control. This, say Tibetan occultists, happens nearly mechanically just as a child, when his body is completed and able to live apart, leaves its mother's womb. Sometimes the phantom becomes a rebellious son, and one hears of uncanny struggles that have taken place between magicians and their creatures, the former being severely hurt or even killed by the latter, end quote. Yes, you heard that right, guys. Tulpas can kill you, and in fact, more often than not, they feel as though they have to kill you in order to stop you from trying to contain them again. We'll discuss that a little later on, possibly the issue of getting rid of them once they have a mind of their own and set about to their own devices. Like I said, though, this woman was an anarchist and wasn't dissuaded in the least from purposely creating a tulpa. I like to think that most of the time these things are created accidentally, but I know better than that, and therefore I don't even want to think about it. While she was in Tibet, she purposely created one of her own in the form of a somewhat overweight, happy-go-lucky monk. By the end of it all, there was nothing cheerful, jolly, or even heavyset about the entity she created. She went through the whole experience of creating it and everything that happened afterwards in another book as well. She was taught by Tibetan monks, and I'm not sure because my sources are a little bit hazy, but I think they taught her all of this either to help her understand why she shouldn't ever create one, or they might have been teaching it to her, and I think that this is more than likely the reason, to make sure that when she did create one, she was well equipped to keep it jolly and happy, and so she would be almost guaranteed a positive experience. Positive experience is very far out of the norm, but it is possible. Again, I refer you to imaginary friends that kids usually make up between 18 months and 2.5 years old, and sometimes carry all the way to adulthood. That's a happy experience, I think. As I said earlier, though, there is no way in my mind that this could ever turn out well. Even with the most innocent of creations of these thought forms brought to reality in real life, there will come a point when it wants independence, and if it isn't given freely, it'll just be taken. If it is given freely, then you are responsible for whatever it does, and of course we'll want to keep an eye on it, but that won't work because the entity it wants its own control. It doesn't want anyone keeping an eye on it. I hope I'm making this easy to understand. There's nothing that you can do to keep it tamed or at bay, and for some reason, almost 100% of the time, they turn out to be anything from a bit mischievous to downright evil. Miss Fortune remained dedicated to creating the jolly monk from her own thoughts for no less than a few months. She was excited about the prospect despite knowing what she herself had written in her book years earlier, which is the quote above that I just read to you, about the accidental making of the wolf and how scared she was. So Miss Fortune's monk started out like any other tulpa come to life. It was seen in the beginning as only a brief flash and shadow of the form she wished to create. It would manifest itself first in her house, and it wasn't flesh and bone at first. It was barely recognizable, and sometimes I think that when people are being haunted by something very obscure that barely is able to materialize in their presence, that they could be on the verge of the accidental creation of these entities, but because their will, or even sometimes their magic, with a K, isn't strong enough, it vanishes and is never seen again by them or anyone else. As time went on, and this was more than likely over the course of another few weeks or months, the monk became more and more visible, solid, and substantial. Miss Fortune said of the entity originally that he, quote, eventually became kind of a guest living in my apartment, end quote. Not long after the monk was fully formed and for all intents and purposes a house guest, she had to go on tour. I think she was like a book tour. She merely said, quote, I started for a tour with my servants and tenants, end quote. At this point, though, the monk no longer needed her to think about it in order for it to be able to fully materialize and was able to come and go as it pleased, and no longer came and went at her discretion. To me, this is a very bad sign, very bad omen. This means that the power was shifting and the entity was doing what it wanted when it wanted to do it. No bueno. You might be thinking, well, Gemma, it was only existing on its own, and you would be 1,000% right, but this is the first step in complete autonomy on the part of the Tulpa. Understand that as time went on, this creation became as physical, solid, and real looking as you or me. Guys, just think about that for a second, if you will. You could be walking around and pass by, maybe even have a chit chat on the street or in the bar or whatever, whenever, wherever, with a frickin' Tulpa. His robe would touch her shoulder as he walked by her and she would physically feel it. And one time she said he even roughly grabbed her by the shoulders and it was just as if any human man had done so. This wasn't a playful thing, and the monk's creator was about to realize all of this comes at an extremely large cost. Just as with any sort of magic like this always does. I always warn you guys, I always do. Human beings, we are not actual gods, and therefore, aside from bearing children through the traditional means that we were given, we are not the creators of actual human beings, and we should never be even so much as dabbling in this type of magic. I cannot stress this enough because I know there's going to be that one person or possibly a few in the comments who decides they want a friend or a playmate or a lover. Maybe someone will think setting Tulpas out on their enemies is just a fine idea. You've been warned by me. I'm warning you now. Don't do it. As this Tulpa monk became more based in reality and less pulled from the ether, it started to change its appearance physically as well. Instead of chubby and jolly, it became slim, toned, fit, and menacing. It changed its appearance to be more attractive to human beings, who it planned on interacting with in its own free time and according to its own free will, which I might add, it now had free will due to the fact that it was now a fully formed, completed physical being. You know what's terrifying about all this, in my opinion? It was literally no different than me or you. The happy and easy smile was replaced with an evil and knowing grin that was constantly plastered across its face. The creature became sly, quote, troublesome and bold, end quote, in the words of Miss Fortune herself. The most frightening thing that happened, though, and it would be apt to use the term development here, is that the thing just randomly one day, as Miss Fortune stated, quote, escaped my control, end quote. It was now completely and totally free, and from what I understand, it took longer to destroy it than it did to create it and for it to develop. I don't know the exact details on how this thing was eventually destroyed, but the logistics of it don't make sense. People see the Slender Man all over the world, and though I'm not exactly sure what state the person who created it lived in, it seems as though it would be impossible to track and hunt down an entity that can appear and disappear at will, and who can transport themselves through the ether and end up wherever it feels like at any given time. I will look into it though, but it's just crazy. Also, please understand that it took possibly a year or two from the conceptualization and idea of this jolly old monk to the point where it ditched the weight, hit the ethereal gym, and took off on its own. This was just a very quick synopsis of what happened to this one woman and her purposely created Tulpa. Nick Redfern said, quote, a Tulpa is a creature that is created and driven by the power of human imagination, end quote. Let's say, for example, you constantly and consistently think about and focus on the image of a pixie-type fairy, kind of like, Tinkerbell, for long enough and with enough intent and intention, whether willful or not. You then give it some type of pretense of reality, and then eventually it becomes its own conscious entity and starts to exist little by little independently. This isn't to say that fairies are tulpas, but tulpas could be fairies. Most people who try to bring thought forms to life use some sort of deep trance meditations in order to enter a severely altered state of reality while meditating and thinking on the particular image. That usually makes the whole process, which would be very irresponsible of me to walk you all through right here and now, go much faster. And instead of taking several months, it can most likely be done in just a few weeks. So back to the Tinkerbell tulpa. Suddenly you go to work or otherwise leave your house one day, and as you're going about your business, doing whatever it is that you're doing, you see news reports about a terrifying pixie-like creature who has been invading people's homes and businesses in your town. So you've successfully created a being merely by thinking it into existence. Congratulations, good for you. There's the very best way to describe how tulpas come to life. A whole, fully conscious and actively independent entity exists in our world, and everyone else's who is here with us on planet Earth because of your thoughts. Keep in mind here, tulpas aren't flesh and blood, they only seem to be. They live, grow, learn, and thrive just the same, and sometimes more so than any other average living being or entity on this planet. It's believed by many who research and know about such things, myself included, that a tulpa is driven to feed on us, and also it needs a fully formed and widespread belief in its existence in order to grow and remain here on this physical plane. The problem that I see with this, especially for the person who either purposefully or accidentally created it, is that the person will know with absolute certainty that it exists and therefore can more than likely never go back to thinking that it doesn't or didn't. That makes them more than likely worry, at least once the tulpa is out of their control or even out of their home, which then feeds the entity even more. Also, if you're doing negative things, if you're attacking people, breaking into homes, showing yourself here and there in the woods, even if it's in blurry form, you're making people fear you. They want to talk about it. They want to get the word out there. They want to go on a hunt. Everyone's thinking about you. It's generating this energy which feeds you and generates your power. It doesn't have to be in close proximity to its creator once other people are aware of its existence and can then live wherever it wants to and feed off of anyone it chooses to confront or otherwise terrorize. This next part is purely speculation on my part based on facts I know about other supernatural entities and how they feed on us human beings, and that's that they seem to not only derive more pleasure but also to become more fully fed off of the lower vibrational emotions and feelings that human beings have. Fear is the most intense and extreme human emotion. Fact. So basically, instead of physically feeding on us, like biting us or draining our blood, it feeds on our belief. The more people who believe in it as time goes on, the more corporeal, and I don't know how to say that word, the entity will become, and the more connected to our world it will become. It will gain strength and physicality from anyone and everyone throughout the world who collectively or otherwise believes in its existence. This is why there are so many people, many of them respected and trusted professionals in this community too, who believe that Bigfoot is nothing more than a tulpa. I know this to be not the case, and I know this with 100% certainty and as an absolute fact. But I try to think about it as though I know nothing about Bigfoot, and I ask myself if this makes any sort of sense, and honestly, it kind of does. It makes sense that creatures and cryptids like Bigfoot, the Mothman, the Loch Ness Monster, etc. are all possibly tulpas who were created for one reason or another millennia ago. Remember, you don't have to set out to create a tulpa and can do so completely by accident and without even knowing that you did so. Slender Man is the best example of what I believe to be an accidentally created tulpa who is more than likely now so physical and enmeshed in this reality that more than likely he isn't going anywhere anytime soon. He's now real. He exists. He is here. Just my doing this video is feeding him and other tulpas as well, because now you're probably thinking of what else could be a tulpa. If it is a tulpa, you're feeding it. So the more people who believe in the tulpa, even the ones who start out as benign and jolly, like the aforementioned monk, start to, for unknown reasons, become malevolent, malicious, deviant, mischievous, and eventually downright evil. In order to make sure people continue believing in it, so that it can continue existing and thriving, they have to make sure they're constantly on the minds of as many people as possible. Take again Bigfoot, for example. All of the random and unprovable sightings and the inability to ever gather any type of evidence. It's almost like it gives just enough of itself to entice people to set out to prove its existence while still remaining in the shadows as an unknown being and or creature. Does that make sense? Let me know in the comments below what you think about all this craziness. Being a recovering addict, it seems to me as though the tulpa needs a constant stream of belief flowing to it, a belief that to me is exactly like an addict needing another hit of their drug of choice. Let's now take a look at another case of someone who actually created a tulpa. As always, guys, I don't ever bring anything to you that I don't 100% believe in myself. And if I do, I always let you guys know that's the case. Like, hey, I think this is BS, but here it is. Whether or not you believe in tulpas is completely irrelevant because I'm not trying to change your mind. As I always say, I would simply like to open it a tiny bit more. Richard Freeman was formerly the head zookeeper at Twycross Zoo in England. He developed a really deep interest in the field of cryptozoology. For those of you who don't know what cryptozoology is, it's very basically an interest in and study of unknown creatures. Examples being the aforementioned Mothman of Point Pleasant, Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and others just like them. Freeman believed that the above-mentioned animals and so many more, the Chupacabra, the Abominable Snowman, I prefer to call him the Adorable Snowman, but whatever, etc., are all simply flesh and blood animals here on Earth, and in this reality whose science and zoology simply haven't been able to learn enough about yet in order to classify them. He also believes, somewhat contradictory, that some or most of them are actually tulpas. Back in the 1990s, Richard Freeman wanted to try and prove some of the points he was trying to make about everything that he believed that I just mentioned to you, and he purposefully set out to create and bring to life his very own thought form. He was a self-proclaimed goth, and he absolutely devoured anything written by people like Clark Ashton Smith and H.P. Lovecraft. With that in mind, he decided to make his creation a gigantic spider-like monstrosity whose personality he set out to make as malevolent as possible. So he purposely set out to create a malevolent and evil giant spider being. He said he took his inspiration from a spider deity he came across in the writings of Clark Ashton Smith. Let me just stop here for a minute, guys, okay? Because I have a few things to say. Now, I understand wanting to create a tulpa. I really, really do, especially to prove a point, especially with this guy's interests and with the things he surrounded himself with that he read and his basic interests. But to purposely set out to make something so horrific and evil on purpose while being in the field of research and the profession that he was in, bad idea, and I'd hate to say it, but shame on him. However, on the other hand, how can myself or any of us judge? Because it's very easy to get caught up in romanticizing things like this when we think we have all the facts and we actually don't, and more than likely, we never will. That's most likely what was happening here. I have to keep telling myself that in order to give some redemption to this man for what eventually happened due to his ignorance and irresponsibility. And after I read through it, I understood that he did have some sense to him and he did come to an understanding of what was going on. In the story of the Seven Geeses, and that's spelled Geases, so I may be pronouncing it wrong, which was published in 1934, Atlak Nacha is the spider deity and he is absolutely abhorrent and terrifying. He has a semi-human looking face and gigantic hairy spider limbs and body. He/it lives in an unlit and hellish subterranean world of cave systems that are said in the book to exist underneath the fictional Mount Vormithrath. Somewhat coincidentally, maybe, this arachnid creation is said to have a spindly spider legs in and out of both the world of humans, our world in physical reality, but also in a somewhat ethereal dream state type world, meaning he could menace the dreams of human beings if he really wanted to. Now, I've never read this book or any of the other works by this author, and that's only what I took and understand from my source material, so if I'm mistaken in that, please respectfully correct me in the comments below and try if you can to explain it all. It was somewhat confusing, but okay, so for all intents and purposes of this video, this spider god was able to penetrate dreams and walk freely in our reality. Any thought form that comes to life can do the same. Let me say that one more again. Any thought form that comes to life can do the same. Maybe shadow people. This has me like really thinking, it has my mind reeling. So anyway, guys, while it always has to start in the realm of the imagination or even of dreams, it very rarely is content to stay there, and so very rarely actually does. In the summer of 1997, when he was a student at the University of Leeds in England, Richard finally set out to create this monstrosity of a tulpa. At the time, he was working towards his degree in zoology, but he took his creation of the arachnid god tulpa very, very seriously. Obviously, this would be one of the vital things you would need in order to assure you are being successful. taking it all extremely seriously. He wasn't about to embark on this himself though, and in fact he enlisted the help of a few of his friends at the university to help him out as well. The very first thing they did was create a homemade altar for Atlak Necha to come to life. The friend group helping him mainly consisted of his roommates, and they constructed this altar right in the basement of their rental home. They really put a lot of hard work, time, energy, and effort into this project. Among so many other things, and just as one example, they took large pieces of cloth and made a giant fake spider web, which they hung down there. At the foot of the altar, they chanted a complicated series of prayers and sacrament to the fictitious beast. All of this was put together and carried out with the solitary goal of bringing the creature from Clark Ashton Smith's book to life. They weren't creating the exact monster from the book or books. I'm not sure if there's more than one about this thing. And each of them added a little something of their own to the makeshift monster. For months on end, each of the roommates and Richard himself all dedicated hours on end and most, if not all, of their free time, collectively and individually concentrating on the version of the monster that they had all agreed upon. And, as it so often does when done correctly, their little project actually worked. From the darkest depths of the minds of these young people, a monster sprang forth. Late one night, a couple of months or less after they had originally started to go through with the plan, Freeman himself crept down into the darkness of the basement where the altar was with a plan to continue trying to further enhance the Tulpas form and to further bring the arachnid into reality. To his horror and with a bit of disgust, he immediately noticed a giant shadowy image crawling along one of the walls of the old and dingy cellar. It was very obviously a gigantic spider. It had 8 legs and the usual bulbous body shape, and it creeped slowly and steadily along the wall. I don't understand why this young man was shocked in the least, frozen in place due to terror and fear as he was, because this is exactly what he had set out to do in the first place, right? He was a man with a plan, and the plan came to fruition, and now he's scared. Apparently, though, he was very surprised, and the image of the creature he had set out to create in the first place now horrified him. He couldn't move at first, but as the monster approached him, he was able to break the spell of fear-driven paralysis within just a few moments. He slowly backed away, crept up the basement stairs as quietly, as quickly as he possibly could, and shut the door behind him. He also made sure that he locked the door behind him as well, just for good measure and to be safe, I guess. I mean, I don't understand this part, but whatevs. This guy purposely set out to create this horrific thing, but then gets the shock of his life and gets scared once it's actually created. Okay, moving on. The image of the spider for that first sighting was described as he only saw a shadow. This more than likely is meant to imply that though it was definitely working, it would have taken a whole lot more to make this thing physically real. Luckily for all of those involved, and luckily for all of us sitting here now, who knows, this was enough for Richard and his friends. They were satisfied that they had proven Richard's initial point and that they had begun to create this monster out of their collective and individual thoughts. They were afraid though, and in my opinion with good reason, and they ended the experiment that very night, if not very soon after. They basically exterminated Atlak Necha and tore down the altar they had so carefully and lovingly created for him. All of the friends did everything that they could to stop themselves from thinking about this creature. They all later admitted that it was extremely hard for them not to think about it because they now knew that he was somewhat real, and there was a part of them, at least for the most part, that was excited about the prospect of it and what it all meant. After reading about this one, I often wonder if we would have some sort of insanely huge and terrifying spider being running around and being sighted all over the planet nowadays, just due to the fact of what these young kids did so many years ago as part of what some would call a pet project. No pun intended, of course. I mean, would we have named it? Would it be just another in the long list of unknown creatures that some scoff at, others make ridiculous statements and assumptions about, and that still others call nothing more than mere urban legends? I'm, of course, referring to the aforementioned cryptids and other unknown entities we are all so very familiar with already in this community. Before we end, I think it would be remiss of me not to mention Alan Moore. He is a comic book writer and is the man behind such amazingness as V for Vendetta and The Watchmen. In 2005, another of his most famous creations came to life on the big screen with the movie Constantine. The movie was hugely popular, and so many people, myself included, came to love the movie's main character, John Constantine himself. However, Not long after he initially conceptualized the character and before the movie itself became such a big hit, Moore insists that he actually encountered John Constantine in the flesh. Of course, and no doubt, he encountered a tulpa. In an online article written by Jim McGrath, which was called Conjuring Constantine from August of 2012, Moore said of the whole thing, quote, "He looked exactly like John Constantine. He looked at me, stared me straight in my eyes, smiled, nodded almost conspiratorially, and then just walked off around the corner to the other part of the snack bar," end quote. Moore was a nervous wreck and sat for quite a while wondering if he should approach the character, but eventually he chose not to. Once I found out that Alan Moore is not only an acclaimed comic book writer and creator, but also a practicing chaos magician, I wasn't the least bit surprised. I know what some people think of chaos magicians and chaos magic, but let's try to remember what we're all here for and what the nature of the discussion is, please, so the comment section doesn't become all about that one little tiny tidbit of information. Okay, with that being said, it didn't surprise me in the least that this amazingly talented man, who also practices chaos magic, would be able to so easily create a tulpa of his own. So, simply put, chaos magic directly involves the conjuring and creating of sometimes fictional characters and bringing them into life in some sort of semblance of reality. I've actually used them before for things like when I was in someone's home and realized that they have some sort of monster, energy, entity, creature, thing that I had no idea how to handle, or a malevolent entity that I know has a specific fear and otherwise won't leave. Things like that. That's very, very simplified and watered down, guys, I know. The chaos magician will come in, create his or her monster, and wrangle up whatever is left over once I'm done with the place. It's extremely rare that I would call them in for anything, but if I do, that's the main reason why. Anyway, who knows what would have happened if he had approached the Constantine tulpa and how that would have turned out. Luckily, the story doesn't seem to be common knowledge, and therefore we aren't being terrorized by the beloved comic book creation. Not yet, anyway. More than likely ended up with nothing to feed on and evaporating into the ether. That's another video altogether as far as what happens once tulpas finally are eradicated, if they ever could be eradicated. I was going to cover it here, but there's way too much, and this video is already going to be super long. From where I'm standing, all of the cryptids and monsters I've mentioned so far don't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. Maybe they're tulpas, and if they are, but that's all just me. That's all I have for you today, guys. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed the content, if you enjoyed hanging out with me, and if you just want to see me smile. Spread the love by sharing this video, please. Please like, please leave a positive comment, okay? Please check out the description box. I did change the description box to all my videos with updated and accurate information. Anything you need from me, any correspondence, any questions, if you want a personal reading, the information's in the description box. Beyond that, email me at GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Ways to donate to the channel: PayPal, Cash App. If you become a patron and pledge $20 a month or more, for every month that you pledge that $20, you will receive a free monthly personal intuitive oracle reading from me to you as a thank you. I'm also trying to find time to put like early release of videos or extra special shorts and things like that on the Patreon content board. So just give me a little bit more time on that. The Kindle and paperback versions of all three of my books, Missing the Faith Theory, Encounters with Evil, 101 True and Terrifying Stories, with the foreword written by Steve Stockton, or Shadow Entities, Sleep Paralysis, and Beyond, available on Amazon. The link's in the description box for all of them. And if you'd like a signed or autographed copy, email me first, GemmaJadeParanormal@gmail.com. Every Wednesday night, right here on this channel from 7:15ish till we run out of people to read for, come in and get a one-card random pull personal intuitive oracle reading for your next week. Hang out in the chat. It is the best chat on the internet. I say that hands down. Everyone is so loving and full of light and amazing. You will find your tribe if you're an empath or light worker or have any sort of ability, or just someone looking for a tribe. We are the island of misfit toys. We are the weirdos mister. On Monday afternoons, every other Monday so far, I'm still trying to figure out that schedule, at 12 noon Eastern time, it's myself and Ghost Dragon ZW until 1 p.m. Eastern time, trying to make sure there are guests on there as much as possible. We're going to be interviewing. So guys, I have a lot going on in this channel. I have so much more to come. Anytime Oracle, trying to still do 2 videos a week. I want to do something else that I don't see anyone else doing, so I don't want to mention it yet, but it's probably going to be in short format. I know I'm forgetting a ton of things and I always yak your ear off at the end of the video, but really, sincerely, I appreciate all of you guys. Don't forget, donations are what help the channel thrive, survive, and go on. Helps me to be able to do this full time to bring you better content and to get all the things done that you guys ask me to do. PayPal, Cash App, Patreon. My Amazon wish list gift link is in the description box if any of you guys want to send me a deck, a crystal. There's so many different things on there and you can do that safely so I don't have to give my address out. You just send it through Amazon. Be kind to each other, guys. It doesn't cost anything. Be kind to yourselves and never accept anything less than others being kind to you. You are a beautiful soul. I believe in you. You can do anything you set your mind to. Be sure to manifest only the best for yourself. Always go in grace, smile at a stranger, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.